Hello, I'm Angela V. John. I'm an honorary professor at Swansea University. I'm a biographer and historian and the author or editor of a dozen books, one of which is Turning the Tide, The Life of Lady-Rhondda. My title plays on the name of a novel by H.G. Wells called Mr. Britling Sees It Through. This book doesn't attract much attention today, but it was immensely popular when it was published in 1916. Its story of a renowned writer called Mr. Britling, for which in part read Mr. Wells, explores the devastating psychological effect of the First World War on British society. Mr. Britling's view of humanity is profoundly altered as he witnesses the impact of war on himself, his beliefs, and those around him. I've chosen this title for several reasons. One is that, as we shall see, H.G. Wells features in Time and Tide, and he was in a number of respects Lady-Rhondda's bête noire. And she started her weekly paper not long after the end of the Great War, so I think it's important to bear in mind its cataclysmic effects. There ensued a widespread weariness and desire for peace and stability, but there were also demands for real change and reconstruction, articulated by women in particular, and clearly voiced by Lady-Rhondda, who founded, funded, and was soon editing Time and Tide. But first I'll say something about my subject. She'd been born Margaret Haig Thomas in 1883, the daughter of a very successful South Wales industrialist and Liberal MP, D.A. Thomas, always known as D.A., from a large family that had made its fortune in the coal industry of the South Wales valleys, hence the Rhondda title. Her mother, Sybil Haig, came from a more genteel background with long established roots in Scotland and a branch of the family in rural mid Wales. Sybil played an important part in the Women's Liberal Association. Although Margaret was born in London, she and her family returned to Wales when she was a tiny child. And she grew up on a 200-acre estate on the edge of the country village of Llanwern, close to Newport, Monmouthshire, in southeast Wales. Her parents were enlightened about the rights of their only daughter. She attended progressive girls' schools, Notting Hill High and then St Leonard's in St Andrews, before studying at Somerville College, Oxford. She left, however, of her own volition after just 2 terms, something she later regretted. As a young woman used to discussing ideas and business with her father and freedoms such as driving her own car, the chaperoned life of a female university student at this time seemed to Margaret far from liberating. She married the son of a local landowner, becoming Mrs. then Lady Mackworth. It was not a good match. His passions were hunting and shooting. She loved reading, and just before she married, she discovered women's suffrage. Some of you might have seen in 2018 one of the performances of Welsh National Opera's highly acclaimed show, Rhondda Rips It Up. It was performed at the Hackney Empire and various other venues across England and Wales, and focused in particular on Margaret's suffragette activities as the Secretary of Newport's Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Here's a still from a documentary about the show. As the libretto put it, based on the words of another real Welsh suffragette, Margaret committed a little bit of arson, setting alight a Newport letterbox. She was imprisoned in Usk jail, where she went on hunger strike. Unlike many suffragettes, she was not, however, rebelling against Victorian parents. Her mother was president of Newport's WSPU, and her father a vice president of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. But she was, like her suffragette sisters, in that she suspended militancy for the duration of the war. In 1915, Margaret survived a truly horrendous ordeal, the sinking of the Lusitania, when she almost drowned before being rescued unconscious from the sea, not far from the coast of Ireland. She became the Commissioner for Wales in the Women's National Service Department based in Cardiff, then moved to London, where she was the Chief Controller of Women's Recruitment in the Ministry of National Service. Post-war, she sat on committees concerned with Reconstruction and resumed her struggle for women's rights. Her beloved father, who'd been elevated to the peerage in Lloyd George's wartime government, had become the nation's food controller, then died prematurely in 1918. DA had obtained special permission from the monarch for his daughter to inherit his title and become the second Viscountess-Rhondda. Sybil was the first as the Dowager Viscountess-Rhondda. But Margaret soon found that although a peeress in her own right, she and other women in the same position were barred from taking their seats in the House of Lords. She campaigned for decades to change this and became known as the persistent peeress. Not until 1958, the year in which she died, were the first female peers created. They were life peers. Only in 1963 were hereditary female peers enabled to sit in the upper house. For decades, Margaret was also a highly influential businesswoman. As a married woman, she'd been in the unusual position of not only working at her father's headquarters at Cardiff Docks, but also earning one of the highest wages of any British woman. She gained very valuable experience as DA's right-hand person. On his death, she inherited her father's industrial empire, encompassing coal mining, railways, shipping, newspapers, and other interests. By 1919, she was sitting on 33 boards and chairing 7 of them, an amazing feat. She held more directorships than any other woman in the UK in the 1920s. In 1926, she was elected the first female president of the Institute of Directors. But it was tough and lonely in the overwhelmingly male environment of big business, and not a good time to be in charge. The depression and long-term decline in the demand for steam coal posed huge challenges. There was, however, one business that Margaret created and cherished. This was the Time and Tide Publishing Company Limited. It brought together her business experience and interest in journalism. She was already a director of the Western Mail, Wales's national daily paper, and owned a number of smaller Welsh newspapers. She'd also sat on the board of the suffrage paper Common Cause in the latter part of the war. Margaret was not a trained journalist, but she threw herself into writing and editing. And in 1943, she was invited to be the first president of the newly formed Women's Press Club. Back at the very end of the 19th century, as a voracious reader with what she called the literary digestion of a shark, the 15-year-old Margaret had produced her first magazine, Spring Tide, note the title. She charged 6p per issue and a penny a line for adverts. Contributors, mostly her long-suffering many cousins, got free copies of this short-lived printed venture with Margaret as editor. When the New Statesman had been launched in 1913, she'd applauded its aims. She too sought to appeal to the intelligentsia, the thinking woman and man in that order, and in so doing, as Catherine Clay has observed, sought to negotiate a position that enabled her own paper to appeal more widely than any woman's paper, yet it also identified, initially at least, with the newly enfranchised woman. In October 1917, Margaret had told a journalist that, "I think the war, awful as it has been, did a wonderful thing for women. It brought about a revolution for them, which one may well imagine centuries might have otherwise been needed to encompass. But now women have seen what they can do. They have learned to have confidence in themselves, to undertake the most amazing and difficult tasks." In the autumn of 1918, just before war ended, Margaret explained that she'd always wanted to found a paper that would realise her dream, quote, to change customs and to influence ideas. Peace, of course, brought the limited vote for women for the first time. But whilst Margaret was set on fulfilling her ambitions, she and others were keenly aware that there was a serious gap between what women felt they could do and what society was prepared to endorse. Now many lost the jobs and responsibilities they'd undertaken when the men were away fighting. Her new paper was to advocate wider opportunities for women in post-war society and to monitor carefully what it called the ebb and flow of the tide. Although she did not want it to be party political, its initial mission was avowedly political in the sense that its lens was one of equal rights feminism. On the 4th of March 1920, Margaret brought together a team of women she'd been carefully cultivating over recent months. Her initial board members came from varied backgrounds, but only Margaret had real business experience. Mona Chalmers Watson, a Scottish doctor and conservative, and the former head of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, was its chair. Members included the American writer Elizabeth Robbins, also a former suffragette and Ibsenite actress. And there was too the head of botany at Birkbeck and a trade union leader. Members' views on feminism and party politics ranged widely. Commenting on her draft leader for the first number, Margaret found that one member, Dame Helen Gwyn Vaughan, was keen for her to tone down the emphasis on women. Margaret's language to describe this pioneering all-female board is significant. She called it a new combine. Her father had created the Cambrian Combine in 1908. That had brought together a number of colliery companies and soon controlled 2/3 of the coal output of the Rhondda valleys, then at the height of productivity. The historian K.O. Morgan has described the Cambrian Combine as a, quote, huge oligopoly that dominated the Welsh economy almost as comprehensively as did the empires of Rockefeller or Carnegie in the United States. Margaret's new company had its office in Fleet Street. It was established with £20,000 worth of capital. From the outset, Margaret controlled 90% of the company's shares and would subsidise the paper throughout its existence. This would increase dramatically in later years when she was pouring much of what remained of her dwindling fortune into the paper. Unknown to almost all, by the 1930s, Margaret's expenditure greatly exceeded her income by almost £16,000 in 1931. £16,000. Retrenchment cut this to just under £7,000 by 1933-4. But from the start, Margaret's subsidies were crucial. Although circulation rose steadily in the first 3 years, selling an estimated 12 to 15,000 copies weekly, but being read by infinitely more, Margaret's private accounts show her already making a loan of £5,500 to the paper in 1921, its second year. She became the chairman, that was her preferred term, in 1926. Although she was not the editor at the outset, that was briefly Vera Lawton, followed by Margaret's personal partner, Helen Archdale. When the paper faced a financial crisis, Margaret took over as editor. It was a move that was disastrous for her relationship with Archdale, but it helped to save time and tide. It saw Margaret move from having spent 3 days a week on the paper to full-time control, a position she would maintain for the rest of her long life. Soon after Time and Tide began, Margaret launched her campaign for what she called her social betterment programme, the 6-point group. Like the earlier Chartists, it was a political pressure group devised to extend to women legal rights to accompany the voting rights recently conferred on many. The 6 points covered legislation on child assault, protection for widowed mothers with young children, and improved rights for the unmarried mother and child. Equal rights for men and women were demanded in the guardianship of married parents, teachers' pay, and opportunities in the civil service. Although it was denied that Time and Tide was its mouthpiece, in effect, Margaret used it to spell out the SPG's aims in articles that she and others wrote, and in naming and shaming those MPs who were not supportive. She also used her business interests to elicit financial support for her paper. Advertisements included companies with which she was directly involved, such as Synatogen, and the paper even carried reports of the AGMs of her colliery companies, as well as far more accounts of events across Wales than was usually the case in a London-based paper. Margaret's journalism for Time and Tide encompassed editorial comments from 1926, some signed, and leaders. She also responded to letters criticising editorial opinion and wrote book reviews. In later years, she penned a few lengthy, weighty articles that were also published as Time and Tide pamphlets. During the war, for example, her 5 articles on empires, prompted in part by long discussions with her Labour friends Herbert Morrison and Ellen Wilkinson, examined and compared the roots, motivations, and consequences of expansion in the 4 powers of America, Russia, China, and Britain. In the late 1920s, the paper began a long-running signed series entitled Notes on the Way. This column gave contributors a free hand to muse in the tradition of newspaper middles on social, political, ethical, and literary subjects. It was refreshingly free from editorial censorship. Margaret began contributing to it herself in May 1933, and she wrote regularly for it for many years. In 1939, it topped readers' favourite features in the paper in a questionnaire, and Norman Angell, Malcolm Muggeridge, and Margaret were declared the 3 most popular contributors. In 1937, Macmillan published a book by Margaret using the series title and covering 38 essays. In that same year, the paper began a light-hearted anonymous column signed by either the 4 winds or by a particular wind. Ellen Wilkinson was, for example, East Wind. It was soon renamed Diary. Margaret contributed from the outset. Snippets of news and personal anecdotes characterised it. It was easy to guess the writer behind some of the entries. It was clearly the editor who was regaling readers with an account of dining with the American president at the White House in 1937. From late 1921 for 5 years, more or less fortnightly, Margaret had written theatre reviews under the pseudonym of Anne Doubleday. The freedom of anonymity enabled her to admit that a light-hearted play called Advertising April made her laugh until her ribs ached and ached. She covered all manner of drama in London and even Paris, providing shrewd and forthright analyses from a feminist perspective. Perhaps what most impressed her was George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, played by Sybil Thorndike. Margaret found it deeply moving and wrote, "I stayed entranced, enchanted, and bewitched." Sounds like a song. She was not the only one. Tyrone Guthrie would later describe it as the outstanding theatrical event of the 1920s. For a 6-part series she wrote in Time and Tide in 1926, she signed herself as Candida, borrowing from Shaw the title of his comic play about a woman's challenge to conventional representations of marriage and gender roles. She called the series Women of the Leisured Classes. Here she drew on Veblen's sociological theory of the leisure class, with its critique of wealthy American women who were expected to live a life of leisure and conspicuous consumption. She scorned the notion of motherhood as destiny and derided the idea that wealthy women had made any progress since 1870. It was a deliberately provocative series, as she admitted to Elizabeth Robbins, designed to generate at least correspondence and ideally a controversy. It worked, helping circulation and publicity. The Hogarth Press also published the articles, and in 1927, Margaret boldly engineered a public debate on the subject with G.K. Chesterton at the Kingsway Hall. Chaired by Bernard Shaw with Vera Brittain and Winifred Holtby as stewards, it was a sellout. The BBC broadcast the event on the wireless. Margaret valued Shaw as a brilliant playwright, thinker, and friend. She particularly appreciated his writing for the paper. Looking back in 1941 on its history, she declared that his article for a bumper issue in 1929 had put Time and Tide on the map. It had sold out within an hour, even though 4 times the usual number of copies had been printed. But this did not prevent her from then writing 6 detailed critical articles about the women in Shaw's plays. Believing that Shaw was a good deal more enlightened than most men when it came to representing women, Margaret argued that it was therefore all the more important to point out that he nevertheless still subscribed to what today we would call the priority of nature over nurture, and believed in biological determinism. Her detailed analyses of Shavian characters argued that he compartmentalized women, dividing them into recognizable types such as mother and mistress. Margaret's spirited articles can be criticized, not least for her underestimation of the primacy of socialism for Shaw, but they produced a positive and lively response from readers, as she wished, and they continued to respect each other and maintained their friendship. A portrait of Shaw hung on the wall of the editor's office in Bloomsbury Street. He described her as an editor in 1,000. Margaret's final Notes on the Way articles in 1956 were a tribute to Shaw. Her analysis of Shaw's work was a far cry from her critique of H.G. Wells as a writer and man. In 4 long articles in the paper in 1930, she attacked Wells's fictional representation of women. Catherine Clay describes the series as an early example of feminist literary criticism that sets out to analyse images of women in male-authored texts. Wells was immensely influential at this time, but Margaret readily condemned his fictional women as victims of his sexism. Influenced by working with more than one woman who'd been involved with Wells, and Rebecca West was even a director of Time and Tide, Margaret was convinced that he confused sexual freedom with women's rights. In his 1937 novel, Brynhild, Wells got his own back with a parody of Time and Tide as Wear and Tear, a weekly paper voicing women's discontent, run by Lady Roundabout and a group of women who appeared to delight in being disagreeable. The Welsh novelist Jack Jones, who wrote for Margaret's paper, had published a book called Rhondda Roundabout. On its first page, he'd stated that a woman, quote, who ably edits an independent review is now the proud bearer of the name of this once turbulent and prosperous area. E.M. Delafield parodied Time and Tide as Ebb and Flow in The Autocracy of Mr. Parham. And Margaret features in her better-known Diary of a Provincial Lady. Delafield was well acquainted with the editor. She was a member of Time and Tide's board, and her popular book started life as a serial in the paper. Delafield had sent in the first instalment with a note saying that she didn't think much of it, so if Margaret agreed, it should go into the wastepaper basket. Fortunately, the editor did not concur. The book is dedicated to Margaret and the other directors and has never been out of print. Delafield's witty depiction of the charming Anne the Viscountess, for which read Margaret, extends into the sequel, The Provincial Lady Goes Further, where Delafield describes one of the paper's legendary parties hosted by the editor, at which, quote, several hundred millions invade the Park Lane Hotel. Margaret worked hard and played hard. Vera Brittain privately criticised the way that she took long holidays. Brittain had difficulty accepting that big business could be part of Bloomsbury, and her view of Margaret and vice versa needs always to be seen in the light of Margaret's close friendship with the ailing Winifred Hopeby, who was employed on the paper as well as writing for it. Virginia Woolf did not share Brittain's view of Margaret and noted after dining with her in 1933 that, quote, she lives for Time and Tide. In the same year, the journalist James Wedgwood Drawbell published A Gallery of Women, his illustrated account of 20 prominent women, ranging from Margot Asquith to Greta Garbo, included Margaret, and was also published in the magazine Britannia and Eve. Drawbell interviewed Margaret at work. He wrote, not for her the quiet background of the home or the gay background of the restaurant, it had to be the office. He describes meeting the female office staff at 32 and 34 Bloomsbury Street before being taken up to meet the woman in black in her office. Drawbell's employer, Lord Camrose, was one of 3 highly successful Berry brothers, newspaper magnates originally from Merthyr, whom Margaret had known since childhood. so Drawbell was more predisposed than some journalists to present a sympathetic account, albeit one rather obsessed with emphasising what he detected as her maternal qualities. By the 1940s, when the paper's circulation had reached 40,000 copies, Camrose wrote in a book about British newspapers and their controllers that Margaret had made her paper respected for the vigour and breadth of its views. In 1922, she visited the United States. The New York Evening Mail called her a handsome, well-built viscountess. Predictably, much attention was given to her appearance. One paper described her as a vivacious young woman with the rosy cheeks of a 17-year-old. She was almost 40. The British press called her a tall, well-made, jolly, big girl. Some papers used her appearance as reassurance that the masculine world of business had not adversely affected her femininity. Yet some journalists implied the antithesis of this. One US paper depicted her as tall, athletic, with the stride of a comely man in her utilitarian, well-cut clothes, low heels, and lack of a hat. Another noted that her handshake was quick and firm. Issues of gender identity were increasingly addressed, but often by indirect means, so her gestures were portrayed knowingly. The Daily Mail reported that she whistled like a jolly errand boy as she left her office. But how did her own staff and contributors see her? The loyal Winifred Holtby found her consistently supportive and her editorial direction, quote, a constant stimulus. She also praised the way that Margaret was open to new ideas. Like others, Holtby couldn't resist using Margaret in her creative writing. She features in her unpublished 3-act comedy, Efficiency First, as Sarah Terrans, a self-confident, handsome woman who, in addition to her press, runs a host of businesses such as Dynamic Dairies. Most of Margaret's office staff stayed at the paper for many years, though when taken on, they were already familiar faces to her. They included her goddaughter. Contributors and other journalists respected her tolerance. Concerned to reflect current debates, she gave space to opinions that didn't match her own. For example, Wyndham Lewis's 6 articles on German National Socialism and Hitlerism in 1931. Margaret upheld the freedom of the press and stoutly defended independence of party politics and a progressive take on the arts. In the 1930s, the paper remained largely staffed by women. The board of directors changed over time. By 1928, none of Margaret's original appointees remained, and during the paper's literary turn between 1928 and 1935, it drew increasingly on a younger generation of modern women novelists. But the halcyon days inevitably gave way to tougher times. The war changed everything, including Margaret's opinion of Churchill. She increasingly saw him as the greatest statesman of the day, and despite her earlier slightly left-leaning views, she was now prepared to endorse him as a leader for peace as well as war. The paper was critical of Attlee's Labour government. By 1951, just 19 days before the general election, it was announced that it would be supporting the Conservatives. The Independent non-party tag was replaced by that of Independent Weekly. Churchill's government was welcomed, and although this was not unconditional, for example, its Middle Eastern policy was criticised, nevertheless, both the editor and more than a third of its readers were by 1957 acknowledged Tories. The paper had become an international politics journal, and although some stalwart women still contributed, for example, Rose Macaulay and Rebecca West, male contributors and readers now tended to dominate. The price of survival had been a massive adaptation. There were challenges not only from Sunday papers and other weeklies, but also from radio and now television. The financial strain was increasingly evident. Margaret's long-term partner since the 1930s, the paper's literary editor, Theodora Bosengate, that's actually how her name is meant to be pronounced, I gather. Theodora Bosengate recorded in her diary management meetings in the 40s at which circulation papers were discussed, along with the urgent need for economising. By the late 40s, the paper was losing about £150 a week. Yet Margaret, who'd poured more and more of her own money into it, was used to a luxurious lifestyle, and retrenchment was not a word she ever fully understood. Increasingly, many saw Margaret's dogged determination as problematic. John Betjeman was literary editor for 3 years in the early 1950s, then was suddenly sacked over lunch. He predictably wrote a poem called Caprice. Its title not only referred to where the sacking took place, but also to the editor's capriciousness. Part of the problem was due to the ageing Margaret's ill health. A cruise in 1957 designed to alleviate her ailments resulted in a fall that made her a permanent invalid. And then stomach cancer was diagnosed. She was now 75, and she and the paper to which she dedicated much of her life were terminally ill. Here's the older Margaret at Llanwern with her elderly mother, Sybil. Margaret died on the 20th of July, 1958. Her obituary in the Times was simply headed "Champion of her sex." The paper limped on, but not for much longer, and soon became unrecognisable. After Margaret's debts and obligations had been honoured, there was not even enough money left over to honour all the bequests in her will. And so we come back to my title, and Mr. Britling sees it through. In some ways, Wells's book reads like an extended piece of journalism rather than a novel, since its author was living through and writing about the war at the time, rather than reflecting back with hindsight once it was over. By the same token, Time and Tide can be usefully read forwards, unfolding as it does a history of much of 20th century literature, political struggles, and much else. But whereas the eponymous Mr. Britling and other Brits endured, Margaret-Rhondda, the paper's owner-editor, did much more than this. Aided by her pioneering team, she invested in her creation in more ways than one and triumphed over the decades. Although in the last years, her efforts were increasingly against the odds and in the face of impossible challenges from the new media of the day, Lady Rhondda saw it through to the bitter end. Well, that's the end of my talk, but it's not really the end of the story. I'm currently part of a group called Monumental Welsh Women, raising funds for 5 statues of historical Welsh women. The first, to be unveiled in 2021, will be of Wales's first black head teacher, Betty Campbell. Lady Rhondda is also one of these 5 women chosen by a BBC poll. We're now just over 1/3 of the way towards raising the £100,000 needed to erect a statue to her in Newport. Please contribute towards this campaign. Here's the website. Thank you.